to the Black Pelican. Thank you for coming out tonight. We are here tonight in honor of the Lost Colony's 75th anniversary, and we have invited the leading players in the English colonization of Roanoke Island to be here with us this evening. And that is no easy task. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and Sir Walter Raleigh in 1618. So we've used all of our theatrical magic to get them, and they are here tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, please stand for Sir Walter Raleigh escorting Elizabeth, Queen of England, France, Ireland, and the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Yeah.
Unto my people, greetings.
Your Majesty, welcome to the 21st century. Your radiance and beauty continue to outshine all of your portraits.
And you are a silver-tongued devil.
So, as you know, once a year the residents of the Outer Banks gather to reflect on their unique Elizabethan heritage. And we greatly appreciate your and Sir Walter Raleigh's agreeing to participate in our trip down memory lane tonight. So perhaps I could ask you a few questions, and you and Sir Walter could share your memories with us tonight.
We'll certainly do our best.
With pleasure.
So my first question for you this evening is about Sir Walter Raleigh's meteoric rise in your court and favor, and it's been the fodder of storytellers for over 400 years. Our curiosity abounds. How did you meet?
Oh, that's a time I remember quite fondly. I was 29 years old, and I was reading law down at the Middle Temple, and I knew if I were to ever make anything of myself, I would have to, well, capture the attention of someone who could afford it. And to capture the Queen's attention, you had to look better than I did at the time. I didn't have a farthing in my pocket. So I went to a fellow who made clothes, and I asked him to build me a suit, and a fine suit he built me. Of course, it was on spec. I promised to pay. Caught a ride with a merchant friend of mine across the Thames over to Greenwich, where I waited, because I knew that if I waited just long enough, the Queen would have to pass by me to get to her barge, and I could make myself known to her. Well, it was a long wait. Like many women, she took her time, and I waited and I waited. And it was not a good day to be waiting. It'd been raining sometime, and so the paths were all muddy, the roads were filled with water. But I sat there until I was just about to give up. I'd almost lost all confidence that she would come. And then there she was. I saw her coming down the road, a vision like you've never seen. The sun and moon hold no countenance to this fine lady. It's the truth. She was coming at such a clip, dragging all of her courtiers and other leeches and ne'er-do-well dragon-ons behind her. They couldn't keep up. Everywhere she went was at a clip. When she finally arrived just ahead of me, there was this great puddle of mud. A great puddle of mud, I might add. Biggest thing you've ever seen, and a mess it was. The hogs would have loved it. But I felt that this was my opportunity. So just as she approached, I made the deepest bow I could make, and I swung my cape, it was a beautiful cape he had made for me, yet to be paid for, across this puddle of mud. And just as her foot stepped on the edge, she turned around and cursed her entourage, every man and woman of them, for not taking care of her needs. And then she looked at me and asked me my name. I'll never forget that moment. I looked into her eyes. I told her my name. Well, that very small deed won me her favor. She granted me great riches and a title. She made me, well, Sir Walter Raleigh. She knighted me. Do you recall it differently?
Oh, do I recall it differently? Your story was just absolute arrant nonsense. I have no recollection of any cloak and puddle incident. You were given a minor role, a minor job in the household of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and my master of horse. And that job was given to you by your half-brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Now, I did not meet you then, but I certainly heard about you. You quarreled with everyone, and you even got yourself thrown in prison for disturbing the peace. I didn't meet you until years later, when you came back from Ireland, after your success with my army there. And Lord Grey had sent you back with dispatches for the Privy Council. I was amused with you from the moment I saw you. But the rest of the court despised you on sight. Oh, you were witty, yes, you were witty, but you were arrogant, and you were completely indifferent to everyone, except me. It took a while, but you were my favorite, on and off, for 5 wonderful years.
So, some difference of opinion there. But I think we can agree that your idea to colonize the New World was quite a feat at the time. If we put it in today's terms, it would be as if we were putting a colony on the moon. So, just how did you think of colonizing the New World?
I dreamed of it. From the time that I was old enough to think, I dreamed of planting colonies and developing a place for me to grow wealth. A place that, mostly a place in history for my name. But the adventure is what was important to me. I, as a young man, borrowed a ship from a good friend. Simon Fernandez and I took that ship, outfitted her, and sailed her to the West Indies. And that was an adventure. These were hard times. These times of going places that were savage. Hard men it took to do that. We got to the West Indies, well, we nearly ran out of food. It was a difficult time, but it secured in my mind that colonizing in the New World was possible.
You have absolutely no concept of the truth. I have no idea about your boyhood dreams, but I can tell you about that ship that you commanded on your trip to the West Indies. That ship was from my fleet. She was the Falcon. And I had loaned her actually to Sir Humphrey Gilbert, to whom I'd also recently given a patent to explore and discover regions in the New World that would be suitable for English colonization. Now, you were part of that voyage, which I point out was a complete failure. You and Sir Humphrey failed to equip ships properly, and you had to abort your voyage shortly after you reached the Azores. Now, everybody else came back to England. Everybody but you and Fernando. Oh, no, you were not coming back. You just had to see the West Indies. And so you did. Even though you damn near starved to death before you got back to England. And let's face it, Raleigh, you are no sailor. You get seasick just crossing the Thames on a ferry.
It can be rough at times.
Now, the Amadas and Barlowe voyage of discovery was your first attempt to find a suitable settlement. We have a scene in our outdoor drama here, The Lost Colony, that interprets their arrival on Roanoke Island, and they're taking possession of the land for your Majesty and her trusty servant, Sir Walter Raleigh. But 6 weeks after Her Majesty granted you a patent to colonize, your ships set sail to discover a suitable site. So, Sir Walter, what is your recollection of the Amadas and Barlowe reconnaissance voyage?
Well, that was the busiest 6 weeks of my life. From outfitting the ships on the Thames to setting sail from Plymouth. A great deal of work had to go into that endeavor. The ships that we took were mine, the larger of the two, the bark Raleigh, and then my pinnace, the Dorothy. Aboard the the bark Raleigh, we placed my cousin and ward, Philip Amadas. He captained that ship. It was the Admiral ship, the largest of the two. And we put Arthur Barlowe, it was, aboard the Dorothy. And we took those ships and sailed them from Plymouth in April of '84. It was. It was a long time ago. Returned in September. It was a fine voyage. The first stop was a bit of a surprise to the men. They stopped first at the Cape Lookout. And at the Cape Lookout they were received by the natives there. Those Indians were a bit different than the Roanoke Indians. As a matter of fact, they invited 2 of our party as dinner. They ate them. This, of course, set the rest of the men back to the ships, and they sailed farther north, where they landed just off of our shores, here where we are today, about Oregon Inlet, where we disembarked and took the lands in the name of Her Highness. And spent the better part of 6 weeks exploring those lands, getting to know the native people, inviting those Indians aboard the ships, entertaining them there, and they entertained the men ashore as well. Some were a bit nervous due to the incident that occurred south. We eat a couple of them and the rest just want to get away. It's a simple process. Well, the natives were so friendly on Roanoke that the men decided to bring 2 of them home with them. They brought Manteo and Juan cheese back to England. And this was the most, well, perhaps one of my finest moments, an act of pure genius. When they arrived in England, I dressed them in taffeta and paraded them around the town. And did they bring a crowd? Ladies and gentlemen, Your Highness, if I may say, we tore the town down with those 2 men, and it was perhaps the finest bit of marketing I'd done in my whole life.
Yes, I certainly do remember that. I remember when you brought them to court to tell about your great success in the New World. And you know, Burley was green-eyed jealous. Oh, how I enjoyed every minute of it. And then, after the ceremony, that's when I knighted you. And Burley was still smarting.
He was hot.
And he paid that comedian, Tarleton, yes, that's it. He paid Tarleton to point at you and say, "See, the knave commands the queen." And so Raleigh then took Tarleton and tied him to a stool. He waxed his beard to his mustache and then paid the masons to brick him up.
He wasn't much of a comedian.
And then you took Thomas Harriot and Manteo and Juan Cheese to a tavern. It was the Mermaid Tavern. They were all sitting there in a very small room in the tavern. They were drinking and trying to learn the Algonquian language, and they were just laughing and smoking that foul tobacco of yours. And that small room got so full of smoke that one of the tavern wenches really thought that everybody was on fire. The room was on fire, the people were on fire. So she ran in there with a bucket of ale and just doused the lot of them. Oh, you got your come-uppance there. And it serves you right for smoking that foul weed. But yes, you certainly did get a lot of mileage out of those 2 Indians. And that, combined with your great success, made it a lot easier for you to find financing for your next venture.
Regarding this new land, you know, the records that have come down to us through the years, there's a bit of confusion as to what exactly this land was called. Now, in our play, The Lost Colony, we call this land Virginia. But what was the name of the land that they discovered?
Oh, I can answer that one. Well, Amadas and Barlowe reported to Raleigh that the name of the land was Wingandacoa. And so Raleigh, of course, used that on all the official documents. However, the truth turned out to be a little bit different. It turns out that when Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlowe were trying to communicate with the natives, they used a mime, a form of gesticulating to try and get their questions across. One of the questions was, what is the name of your country? Well, of course, the Indians had no idea what the actual question was. But at that very moment, one of them pointed at Amadas and said, Wingandacoa, which, of course, Amadas took to mean the name of the country. Well, later on, as Harriet and Raleigh learned the Algonquian tongue, they realized that Wingandacoa means you wear funny clothes. So, the country had been called You Wear Funny Clothes. Well,
Sounded
when Raleigh,
good in Algonquian.
it does have a nice ring to it. But when Raleigh found out, he was a little bit embarrassed. And so he asked my permission to rename the country in my honor. And of course I agreed. And Raleigh coined the word Virginia in honor of myself, England's Virgin Queen.
So, with the Amadas and Barlowe voyage being such a great success and the name of the new country properly named, the next step then was to send a group of explorers to Virginia to locate an appropriate settlement site for towns and villages. And we can only imagine what the excitement must have been like. Can you tell us what it was like for you putting together that first colony?
It was exciting. Those times were invigorating. The first thing we had to do was collect enough resources to make the trip. So I had to go out and find investors. But finding investors was not so hard in those days. During that time, Manteo and Wanchese had created such a great stir that people were lining up. What made them line up, truly made them line up to invest, was our first investor, the Queen herself. She invested in our endeavor by providing us with our flagship, the Tiger. She also outfitted that ship and all the others with enough powder from the stores to satisfy. Wow, now that's an interesting noise.
That's
Heard
a
that at
21st
sea
century,
before.
don't panic.
Are we being called back, do you think?
Perhaps. I don't want to give the head back quite yet. It's come back on me and it feels right nice. But anyway, we got all the stores we needed from the tower, the black powder and such, to protect the ships. And you also provided us with Ralph Lane, I think, and a year's salary for him so he could act as governor on this endeavor. We took with us the assets of Sir Francis Walsingham. He provided us Simon Fernando in a year's pay so that he might navigate our way and be our pilot. He also provided us with 2 ships, captains and crew, the ships, the Elizabeth and the Red Lion, I do recall.
Well, you would recall something named the Red Lion, and you probably drank there many times.
It sounds like a fine place to drink to me. Perhaps we should have named it the Black Pelican.
Next time round.
I hear you. Philip Amadas, he gave me all his landed estates, and that was used to outfit the endeavor. My cousin William Sanderson, he provided money to employ 100 men, and we used them to settle and explore for a year. Who else was with us? My cousin Richard Grenville, he provided ships and sailors as well. I added 2 of my own ships to the endeavor, and we used my own funds to pay for Thomas Harriet. Harriet, he's a brilliant man. We used him in Roanoke so that he might explore those territories and seek out new commodities that might be traded for English wealth. We also acquired mariners and outfitting supplies from Lord Admiral Howard, and a dozen of your courtiers provided 400 pounds each. It was a splendid time. It was rather easy, actually, to acquire the necessaries to make this trip. For the voyage, I appointed Richard Grenville, admiral of the 7 ships. He was our fleet admiral, and we charged him with placing Ralph Lane and his 100 men ashore to do their exploring. I also charged him with one other task that perhaps was the most important bit for this short part to the investors. We asked him to make sure that every Spanish ship he passed, he assailed, and was able to take all the Spanish loot he could take. It worked out pretty well. Ralph Lane, the professional muster master, assembled his 100 men, and the fleet departed from Plymouth. Just before we departed, we came up with a plan. We devised this plan to meet in Puerto Rico in the event that any of the ships were separated from each other on this long voyage.
And was it successful?
Oh, I can answer that.
It'll be negative.
Well, yes, actually, it will be.
Become.
That ship was my ship, the Tiger. She was the best ship in my fleet. And you returned it to me, full of leaks, barely stable, and incapable of navigating across the Thames, let alone the ocean. I don't think that can be classed as a success.
That's true. I have found, though, that the waters in and around North Carolina, although they look great and vast, they're spread real thin. And we did run aground with the Tiger. However, for that expense, for that bit on the expense side of your ledger, the revenue side was quite good. Richard Grenville was a genius at privateering. And it is my recollection that what we returned to England in Spanish loot quadrupled your investment in spite of the Tiger's damages. We also brought back 65 paintings made by John White. These paintings became, well, they became a fine revenue driver of their own. I believe Theodore de Bry made some 17 issues of his engravings. The book itself was a #1 seller, the book of these portraits and paintings. As a matter of fact, I believe it was only outsold by one other book, and that would have been the Bible. It was a success, I think. I would say that after arriving in the Outer Banks, the fleet remained there about 6 weeks. And when we returned with sufficient wealth, I think, to pay our investors. Returning in October. Short period of time, April to October. And I'd say in that short period of time, we were quite successful.
Very well.
Well, you know, using booty gained from privateering to pay the expenses and boost investor profits is really a brilliant idea.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. But after the fleet departed from England, Governor Ralph Lane and his 100 men remained in the temporary settlement on Roanoke Island, using it as a base for explorations to the north and the west. Now, in The Lost Colony, we have a scene in which one of Lane's men beheads the Indian king Wingina. So something must have really gone terribly wrong. What did happen during those 11 months?
Well, initially it went quite well. Ralph Lane did in fact explore the surrounding area, and eventually he decided that the Chesapeake Bay was a much better harbour, and the area around the Chesapeake was much better for planting a colony. So, you see, he did fulfill his mission to explore and to find a suitable place for settlement. And of course, Thomas Harriot gathered invaluable information for map makers. And his treatise on the natural commodities found in the New World and the commodities that could be transported from England and used in the New World, that was a brilliant guide for anyone interested in trade and economic development. And there is one other thing that Thomas Harriot succeeded in doing, which was of particular interest to me. he found a source for beautiful black pearls, and he brought me a rather large sackful of them. In fact, I'm wearing some of those same pearls this evening. Now, on the other hand, Fernando damn near scuttled my ship as he was entering the banks. And as a result, most of the stores and supplies and victuals intended for Lane and his men were spoiled by the salt water that was taken aboard. And this eventually proved to be very, very bad for those colonists. After 11 months on Roanoke Island, Lane and his men were almost at starvation point. The entire area had been suffering through a terrible drought, and no crops would grow, and the game had fled the area. And so Lane and his men were in dire straits, but they weren't the only ones. The Indians were also in a similar situation. So that is when the real trouble started. The Indians, in an attempt to preserve their own meager stores of food, decided that they would attack the English and kill them. But the English discovered about that plot, and they attacked first. And during the ensuing battle, the Indian king Wingina was indeed beheaded. And that made the remnants of his tribe and of his kingdom the deadly enemies of the English, made them the deadly enemies of the English forever. And at that point it became obvious that the Roanoke area was not compatible for colonization.
Well, that's true, all of that. Sir Francis Drake, he had been pillaging down about St. Augustine, and as he came south, took it upon himself to stop in and see about Lane and his men. Well, the men were quite disheartened, and at the first opportunity, they got aboard Drake's ships and sailed home. Well, this proved to be an unfortunate bit, because once they arrived home, they, at every meeting of the people, in every public house, they complained and groaned and grumbled about the hardships of the New World. Unlike the previous year with my Indian friends, I found it rather difficult to come back from that kind of negativity. The investors just would not hear it after hearing of all those hardships. It made it almost impossible to attract investors.
It seems like lack of food was the real issue here, so why didn't you send ships to help?
I sent ships, but it was too late.
But why did you wait so long to send those ships? That was in June of 1586. Yes, I really would like to hear your answer to that question.
Your Highness, you know the difficulties of raising the monies that we had to raise. You know how difficult it was to find investors, to provide the ships and the stores, to get back to Roanoke. It took some time.
Well, you had difficulty in raising money because you were in disgrace. You had written that lewd poem about me, and you had been banished from the court. How dare you do such a thing, and then expect finances to flow your way? You never earned a farthing in your own right. Any money that you accumulated was a direct result of my largesse. And then you insult me by writing that poem, and you expect me to continue giving you money? Never.
It was clever.
Although I do admit you wiggled out of your colony disaster in a very clever way, and I'm sure you're going to tell us about that now.
So, some lessons learned, clearly. So, in 1587, when you were putting together the next colony, what did you change that time?
It took a bit of creative thought. But at the end it came to me. I gave a portion of my holdings in the New World to John White, and I charged him with the task of selling shares to investors and acquiring men to come to this colony and settle it. They were to, well, it was interesting, they were to name the city Raleigh.
And why did you choose John White, an artist, as the governor?
Oh, I can answer that one too. It was a trade-off. Raleigh had never paid John White for those 65 paintings we heard about a few minutes ago. So, he traded acreage in Virginia in lieu of the money.
Well, you know, in our production, The Lost Colony, we mostly speak about Governor White's settlers. There is some confusion about the 1587 colonies being located on Roanoke Island. In the play, we blame it on Simon Fernando. But tell us, why were the colonists deposited on Roanoke Island instead of their intended destination along the Chesapeake Bay?
Well, I had decided to send 24 men. 24 men back to Roanoke. I needed somebody to take care of my holdings. You see, I still owned it. Now, John White, it was his issues. It was not of my making, this failing. He secured most of his funding from Robert Dudley and Christopher Hatton. And both of these men, they aided me. They were on your court, and they despised me. But since Hatton and Dudley were so deeply involved in the Netherlands conflict, they sent Sir George Carey on the voyage to pay attention to their holdings. Well, from what I've heard, John White was no leader of men. In fact, he was an imbecile, is what I've been told. When they arrived back, Carey ordered them all ashore at Roanoke Island, and any that wished to sail on to the Chesapeake could get back on the ships. Well, only 7 men did. The rest disembarked. And as the ships were outfitting themselves again and preparing for their trip back to England, as Simon Fernandez was preparing for that, the colonists, the soldiers and men, they had a bit of a row with John White. They had decided that he was incompetent and unfit to lead. They sent him home. They sent him back to England. When he arrived, he presented me with papers that all but said that they wanted him replaced. Now, he didn't say it out loud, but the papers all but did. I had the opportunity to discuss this with one of the men who had sailed and was there but had returned with John White, a man by the name of Christopher Cooper. And he said, indeed, they were prepared to see John White removed from his position of authority. They were magnanimous enough to allow him to come back to the colony, but they did not want him in a leadership position. They did not want him. They needed another in that role.
But even so, it must have been clear that the settlers needed help. So why was help not sent immediately?
Well, actually, help was provided. I gave Raleigh permission to outfit and send a ship to the New World. But alas, it was John White who did not want to sail without a larger escort. So he wanted to wait for Grenville to outfit his fleet. But alas, time was against them by the time Grenville was ready. The Spanish had already launched their armada and they were sailing towards England to attack. And I had to retain all shipping in England for the defense of England. The Spanish armada sailed up the channel and they were poised for attack. But that ill-equipped flotilla of museum pieces was no match for the daring, adventurous men and my sea dogs, as we all knew it would. The Spanish armada was defeated and England triumphed. Now, after that triumph. There were parties and celebrations. Everybody was so happy. Celebrations continued for months on end, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, John White suddenly seemed to remember that his colonists needed supplies.
It was 1590, so some time we had waited. John White, well, I secured him passage aboard a privateer back to Roanoke Island. Now this got him back to Roanoke, where he found the Indians and the English had departed, leaving only the word Croatoan upon a post outside the palisade. Now John White knew that his colony were going to go 50 miles or thereabouts inland and create the city of Raleigh. I was certain that if they were in difficult straits, they would go to Croatoan. Well, we sent 2 ships. We sent to Hatteras, and we sent 1 ship to Croatoan and could not find them. They and the native peoples had moved inland. Now I had made Manteo Lord of Roanoke and how do you say that?
Dassamunkapuke. It really isn't all that difficult, but he was in fact Lord of Roanoke and Dassamunkapuke. Now Dassamunkapuke is known these days as Man's Harbour, and there's probably a good reason for that because, well, Dassamunkapuke is a bit of a stretch, isn't it?
Well, it's another fine word, but as you know, I don't do so well with the
No, you had
tongue.
trouble with Wingandacoa.
Oh, but it made a beautiful suit. But at any rate, John White, he gave up on his settlers. We looked for ours, but John White gave up on his. He was a broken man. And when he returned to England, I gave him, from the goodness of my heart and wallet, an opportunity to work in Ireland, where he painted the flora and fauna and lived out his life there with Thomas Heriot.
But what of the settlers? What happened to John White's settlers? Did they go up the Chesapeake Bay?
Well, some certainly did. At least a small party of the settlers did go north to the Chesapeake, and they merged with the Chesapeake Indians. And we know this because in 1603, when Christopher Newport was doing his reconnaissance for what would turn out to be the Jamestown settlement, he actually met some of the English settlers who had merged with the Indians. However, shortly after this meeting, the English and the Chesapeake Indians were massacred by Powhatan. Somehow, 7 of the English managed to escape, but subsequently they were once again captured, and they were enslaved and forced to work in the mines along the Roanoke River. Now, there is also some evidence that suggests that another party of the colonists did in fact move 50 miles into the mainland, and they settled along the Chowan River, and they merged with the Chowan Indians there.
So we're not talking about one large group of settlers, we're talking about many small groups of colonists. And of course in 400 years we haven't found trace of any of them. And that suits our play just fine. We all know that mystery sells, yes? But at the end of the day, do you think that your attempts at colonization were worthwhile?
Without a doubt. Worthwhile and greatly successful. Wildly successful in spite of the difficulties. I submit to you, none of the voyages that took place after ours would have had one opportunity at success had they not had with them the resources that we provided on the Roanoke voyages. Thomas Heriot, he provided a text so that every Englishman after me could learn to speak the Algonquian tongue. And when they arrived to this world, they could speak to the natives in their own tongue. That's vastly important, folks, when you're talking about moving into someone else's home. It's good to be able to say thank you. We also have to think about the paintings of John White that documented the flora, the fauna, all of the natives. My very own copy sailed to Jamestown. Without it, they would have been sailing into a blind world, a place that they did not know. These things, I submit, with the maps and charts created by Simon Fernando that told them how to get to the deep water so that they wouldn't have to return and hear about the tiger running aground and sinking and such as that. These are the things that made this voyage successful. These are the items that provided the success that I'm talking about. It was the most fabulous time of my life. I reached my zenith during these years. It was my time.
And I had so much fun too. In all my life, Raleigh, you were the most astonishing man I ever met. All of London absolutely despised you. The court hated you on sight. But you never seemed to care.
I didn't matter.
You boasted and you lied. Oh, how you lied. But you just plunged on with your pursuit of your dreams. Oh, I really, really welcomed the wit and the breath of fresh air that you brought into my world.
And I loved you. I think you liked me too.
Liked you. I adored you.
But you didn't trust me.
Never.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening, for dusting off the death and all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Walter Raleigh and Her Royal Highness. We have a few moments for questions if anybody has a question they would like to pose.
Don't be shy.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
You didn't mention in the Lost Colony play the insistence of women being part of the, which I've lost count of the number of times you went there, but you didn't mention that in the
earlier voyages.
in the earlier voyages.
The
And
first
how
two.
did you actually feel about that, Sir Walter?
By the time we got to the third attempt at this Roanoke settling, it became important. We were having a difficult time, very difficult time, finding investors and finding anyone who would go. So, man, woman, child, if they were willing, we were willing. I think when I look back, after so many years, it was important that we did it. Another, I think, perhaps genius of Raleigh.
Well, actually, I would like to point out here again that here Raleigh is boasting a little bit, as he is wont to do. Actually, by the 1587 voyage, Raleigh's interest, his financial interest, was completely gone. You were, if I'm not mistaken, rather more interested in your Irish estates than you were in the New World. So although you had withdrawn your financial support, probably because I wouldn't give him any more money because he may well have written another series of lewd poems about me. But anyway, that's beside the point. But Raleigh did most certainly lend his name to the 1587 colony, and that in turn did encourage people to go aboard, because despite all his flaws, people still, it was just certain people who didn't like Raleigh, but others would flock to anything he had anything to do with, even if it was simply a name. And on the 1587 voyage, John White, who was this rather ineffective and ineffectual governor, he had 12 assistants, and each assistant was to find other people to go on the voyage.
Pyramid scheme.
Pyramid scheme, Amway. And so the assistants were responsible for providing people to go. And of course, if you're going to take your yeoman farmers, they're in turn going to want to take their wives, or perhaps someone who was perhaps of a higher social class would want to take servants, and many of those servants were females. And there were also children on that voyage, some who had yet to be born, such as Virginia Dare, and another child who was born on Roanoke Island, but there were also younger children too. But strangely enough, there were no girls. All the children were boys. And around that time, a boy could be up to 16 years of age. So when we say boy, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were all 4 and 5 years old. They could easily have been young men, and therefore of great use to the colony. I don't know. I was not there when the ships were loading, so I don't know what the physical makeup of the colonists were, but I imagine that there was very little dead wood on that voyage. I think everybody would have had to have been old enough to make some real contribution once they reached the New World. I don't think there were very many young children, because all young children do really is eat. And they'd already had so much trouble with the food situation. I think probably everybody was old enough to make some contribution. And Raleigh certainly made his contribution with his fine name and reputation.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first is, although this may have occurred after so-called lost colonists were lost entirely, what observations do you have, if any, as to whether the current Lumbee Indians may have been partly descended from portions of the lost colonists? And the second question is entirely different. How did you come about taking tobacco, and why did you not become a very wealthy person in taking tobacco back to England?
The first question, to address that, there's one certainty among all. Every last colonist, man, woman, and child, are dead. That's the one certainty.
Yes, that is the one certainty.
Now, to truly answer your question, sorry, it's pure speculation. Who knows? These are vast countries, and there were many tribes. The thing to remember about it is the tribe of prominence, the one tribe, was the Powhatans. And Powhatan, he was a violent leader, and his company grew in such great, they took slaves and prisoners from, well, across the whole Algonquian language. They were the power. If they survived, it's difficult to say, and mingled and mixed with the native peoples, it is difficult to say where they may have wound up. But I submit that probably not, in that if Powhatan had captured them, you would find them most likely in the northern reaches. South and west, the farther away you get from here and Powhatan, I think the less likelihood you'll see English blood. But that's just my opinion, sir. Your second question was, why did I not gain wealth from tobacco? Because my name is not Duke. Now, you have a better answer than that?
No, I don't really. On the Lumbee Indian thing, of course, that certainly did post-date the colony. And I don't think that any claims to being affiliated with the lost colony were made until relatively recently. And you know, there was a great deal of time between when the colonists were lost. Although I point out at this point, we call them, you call them, the lost colony. I submit to you, they were not lost. They always knew where they were. We're the ones who determined that they were lost. But
So perhaps we should call them the unfound
That's
colony.
right, the yet to be found, something like that. But there was a great time lapse between the lost colonists and when the Lumbee Indians made a claim to being related, during which time, I mean, it was a span of at least, a couple of 100 years, during which time there had been other inroads made by Europeans who could easily have contributed all these characteristics the Lumbees now claim are characteristics from the lost colony. And I do understand that the claim is made that a lot of the surnames of the people who are on the ship's list from the colony are common names within the Lumbee tribe. And I don't actually think that is the case. I think if you compare the ship's list and then the common names of the Lumbee tribe, there's not very much that's similar. Certainly some names could have changed over a period of time, but there is not one dare. I mean, there were some, but I don't think, personally, that the Lumbee claim is something that can be taken seriously. And I think the only way to discover the absolute truth, one way or the other, is through DNA testing. Now, of course, that is phenomenally expensive and very time-consuming. And in order to do an accurate DNA test, there is one thing that you've got to have. Okay, there are so many Lumbees there, that's no problem. We can get DNA. We can get a pound of DNA a day. What we need in order to establish a DNA connection is a relative, a descendant of a colonist, an English colonist. And unless we can find a descendant, it's very unlikely that any DNA can answer the question definitively as to whether Lumbees or some Lumbees are in fact related to the colonists. Finding that relative of the colonist is the tricky point. There are some people in Bideford in Devon who have the same name as some of the colonists. Powell, Andy Powell, I think, is the current mayor of Bideford. And he may indeed be related to Winifred Powell, who was on the ship's list for the lost colony. But we don't know. Powell is a very common Welsh name. It is by no means unusual, so there may not be any connection there. Also, I think there's also another thing that you have to consider. The ship's list was made up, but we've got no actual proof that all those people even got on board. Some may have left before the ship started across the Atlantic. They could have gotten off that ship in any one of several places where the ship called before the final departure.
And others could have
indeed gotten on board. So what we have is a marvelous ship's list. We're very thankful that we do have it, but it is by no means definitive. And I think that is one of the problems with the claims of the Lumbees, that while they can say, yes, they are related, there isn't really any way that they can prove that. Nor is there a way that we can disprove it. And you know, if they can get some mileage out of it and get people visiting, just as the Lost Colony does, more power to them.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Just out of curiosity, how many days travel was it from across the ocean?
About 2 months.
They arrived here on the 4th of July. And they had left, what, in April?
That's correct.
And of course they don't just head straight across, it's not a direct route. They have to go south, I mean they go to the Azores and then they go south and they come up through the Caribbean, and they pause at Puerto Rico and various other places, Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, and because they have to take on water, they need to get fresh meat.
The longest of the trip between the Azores and the islands of the Caribbean. That's the longest bit of trip. The reason you don't come straight across is because the currents and the winds don't work that way. you know of the Gulf Stream. You know of the Labrador Current, perhaps, just off of Hatteras. The reason it's called the graveyard of the Atlantic is because of the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Currents. They oppose each other and they collide in a colossal, beautiful
Maelstrom.
maelstrom. I like that word. It's a fine word. It looks, if you were to shine the sun on it in the early mornings, it might even look like the place in Vegas. It has almost...
Vegas?
At any rate.
This must be Las Vegas on the Isle of Hispaniola, I don't know.
Right.
Vegas? Dear Gussie.
At any rate, these currents direct you where you can sail and where you cannot sail. If you get out of these currents and trades, you wind up in the doldrums, and a man can perish in those doldrums over a long period of time. The ship simply sits still. Fish don't even swim there. So, the longest bit being from the Azores. The first thing you do is you leave England and you stop first, or the last stop is in the Azores, where you reprovision one more time for the longest of the voyage. And when you reach to this side, to the Isle of Hispaniola, or any of the other islands in that Caribbean Sea, you reprovision again and then start making your way up the coast. And it depends. Some days, some trips are faster than others. Yes, ma'am.
Your Majesty and Sir Walter, the story of your first meeting with the cave and the mud puddle is truly the stuff of legend, not.
Yes.
Have you any idea how that started? If you say, Your Majesty, it never occurred, and Sir Walter, did you have anything to do with that?
I can tell you exactly where it came from and how it happened. As I stated, I waited there for a day, the longest day in the wettest environment, and those that dispute it are allowed to. They are queen.
It never happened. That story, and it's a marvelous story, and it would have been fabulous if it had happened, but it didn't. That particular story did not surface until, I think, the 17th, perhaps even the 17th century. I mean, it was well after both of us had been dispatched.
But remember, you never let the truth get in the way of a fine
That's
story.
right. That's right. But yeah, you're right.
Yes, sir.
Were Manteo and Wanchi's brothers, cousins, or chieftain or young chieftains? What age were they when they came to England? And who was Skyco?
Well, the native men that they brought back, I don't believe they were akin, other than the same kin that you and I are, straight back to Adam and Eve. However, they were of the same species, if you will. They Wanchi's was older, I think, than Manteo. They were in their 20s, I would say. It's difficult to say with the Indian people. They do not age in the same manner that we do. I knew an Indian man who was old enough to be my father, and I thought he was younger than I.
Now, Wanchi's was, he was a chief, a chieftain. Wanchi's was. Manteo was not. Even though he is frequently referred to as Chief Manteo, he was not a chief. Wanchi's, however, was. They were had different tribal affiliations. And the other Indian, whose name was actually, I mean, now there's a small place on Roanoke Island called Skyco, but the Indian's name was actually Skiko. And he came back to England. Skiko didn't, which one was it? Laban will tell us. Come on, stand up, Laban, and give us if I'm messing.
Toway came back.
Toway, it was Toway who came back to England. And he came actually before, earlier, from what, the 1584?
Second voyage.
Second voyage, 85 voyage. Toway.
Skiko was a prince. He was the son of Menatona.
That's right, and they took him hostage, right?
Yes.
Yes, they took him hostage, and I believe then he was killed. So there's a distillation in the colony, some poetic license where characters are, and time frames are compressed. But Manteo was not a chief, but Wanchese was. Wanchese actually inherited the throne after Wingina. Am I correct? Yes, he inherited the throne after Wingina was beheaded. And Manteo was not in that particular tribe. They were different.
They called them Algonquians, but that refers to their language. They were of different tribes, but their languages were the same. So when you discuss the Algonquian peoples, that's a language.
I mean, there were Roanoke's, Choanokes, what were some of the others?
Croatoan.
Croatoan. I mean, they were all Algonquian people, but different.
Tribes.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right.